Okay, so we are going to talk a little bit about moderation today. Um, you know, the most cited paper in psychology is a paper by Barron and Kenny, and it's this paper that differentiated moderation from mediation. Prior to that, people just used them interchangeably, I think, and I added the Barron and Kenny paper into your as into the modules, I think, for this week. Did I? Is that right? So anyway, Barron and Kenny laid out the kind of definition of what moderation and mediation is. So, and I like to talk about these in terms of people get them mixed up quite a bit. Anybody have a way that you would define moderation? What is moderation?
Sort of like a relationship that between two variables. It's like a third variable in between the two that affects the magnitude or direction of that relationship. I explained that very bad.
Yeah, no, but you're right. That's exactly what it is. I like to think so. I like to think of moderation as a relationship between two variables that changes as a function of a volume knob, right? Um, you have one variable that can turn up the volume of that relationship or turn down the volume of that relationship. So moderation is a volume knob. Mediation is a door, right? You've got two rooms, and the third variable is that door. And in order to get from room one to room two, you've got to walk through that door, right? And that's how I like to think about these two. So, all right. So, often in psychology, we are looking at group comparisons. If you are an experimentalist, you're almost always looking at group comparisons. And if you want to look at groups, you can look at those just using kind of ANOVA, t-test, whatever, regression. It's all the same thing. But sometimes the relationship between two variables, it functions differently because you're in one group or another, or just because some other variable affects that. So in my area of research and the data that we're going to look at today, a very common one is the relationship between impulsivity and all sorts of different aspects of emotion, right? If you have more positive emotion and you're impulsive, then the relationship between positive emotion and alcohol is stronger. If you have more negative emotion and you're more impulsive, then that relationship is stronger, right? If your emotions are more unstable, same. But if you can reduce impulsivity, if you can tone that down a bit, then you find that the relationship between emotion and alcohol use starts to disappear. This can be important because it might be that some intervention has primary effects on some sort of target, and that target is a protective factor that reduces relationships, right? Reduces the relationship between a risk factor and an outcome. And that's really what we're talking about with moderation, being able to change the relationship from something else. So if that's what you're going to do, then the first step in moderation is identifying like what is going to be my predictor variable, right? What is X and what is Y, and then describing it and thinking about everything that you're going to do from that point forward in terms of the relationship between X and Y. Oftentimes, though, I think people figure out plot an interaction, find a significant interaction, and then they just pick willy-nilly which one is going to be which. Yeah, go ahead.
I just want to remind you, you're recording.
I am recording. Yeah, you bet.
I'm gonna want this thing.
Okay. So I lost my spot. Anyway, yeah, so oftentimes people will, they'll just have a bunch of predictors, right? And so this actually happens when you have like focal predictors that are both important. And so you could say that both impulsivity and negative mood are important predictors of alcohol problems, right? And then you form an interaction to see if these two things are compound alcohol problems, and then you find that they do. And then, of course, the tricky part there is deciding, is it more important that I'm looking at the relationship between mood and alcohol or the relationship between impulsivity and alcohol? And then that aspect is important because it decides what you're going to do with the moderator after that, right? Just out of curiosity, has anyone in here ever done moderated regression or looked at interactions? Angie has, probably with me, right? Or not? I can't remember.
Yes.
Yes? Oh, okay, gotcha. So Angie also has a minor in stats, so that makes sense. Nobody else? All right, what we're going to talk about today then is how we go about doing this, how we go about plotting this, and how we go about writing it up once it's done. So we will look at both two-way and three-way interactions today. We'll look at it. I can't remember if the data that I gave you actually has a three-way interaction or not. They wind up. I'm going to throw a disclaimer out here that I've never thrown out when I talk about moderation, but I'll do it now. Moderation is notoriously difficult to replicate. The impulsivity negative mood moderation happens over and over and over again in my area. But we find that there's actually a really cool, I'm a PBS, I study protective behavioral strategies. There's a really great paper out there where they tried to replicate all of these interactions in PBS across like 4 different data sets, and none of them replicated in any, they like find an interaction here and find one here and find one there, and none of them replicated across data sets. And so that it doesn't speak very well to PBS as a moderator effect, but also it does speak to the fact that moderation is very kind of sensitive to, well, I think sensitive to type 1 error, right? So if you're going to test for moderation, you've got to be pretty kind of theory driven in that. Anyway, all right. So let's look at an example. There's a positive association between mood and hunger, and you implement this intervention to break this link. The intervention does not affect positive mood or hunger, but changes the relationship between mood and hunger. And this actually is a data set that you guys will be working with, not today, but in the future. I did an intervention that looked at the relationship between craving and negative mood and craving, and we found that the intervention did not affect negative mood or affect craving, but in the intervention condition, the link between negative mood and craving was gone, and then it got like weaker or stronger as we moved up from to a quasi intervention condition and then a true control condition. So. But I will show you guys that stuff. Just FYI, I have not published it because I don't believe that either. I mean, I feel like, oh, this is a moderation effect that's weird and wasn't initially hypothesized. But it's cool data that I let you guys play with. So
just to clarify, you're saying that the actual values for craving and what was the other?
And negative mood.
So those didn't change after the intervention, but their relationship.
Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah. So. All right. This is what moderation looks like. If you were to draw this out as a structural model, a path analysis, you have these 2 relationships, and here I called it condition. It doesn't have to be condition, right? We're going to do moderation with categorical variables, but today all of our moderation is going to be done with continuous variables. So. All right, so when we want to test moderation, we look at the main effect of X. And in truth, you will also have the main effect of M. But we never really care about the main effect of M. If it's a true moderation model, the most important piece is then the 3rd step or the 2nd step, depending on what all you put in the 1st step, which is the interaction between X and M. If you find a statistically significant interaction of X and M, then that gives you evidence to move on. And you do this in the same kind of, you can do this in the same kind of stepwise fashion that we were doing before, where we were adding kind of focal predictors versus structural predictors, right?
Sorry. So like the parentheses main effect and parentheses test, you're not multiplying that, you're just describing.
So right here,
Is that being multiplied with I, basically, is my question?
oh, I'm sorry. No, this is just
That's
describing.
just
Yeah.
description, Okay.
This is just
Error.
intercept, right?
Oh, okay.
So, all right. So, for categorical variables, for continuous variables, we center those variables, right? But for categorical variables, we don't center them. This was a question on your exam. When do you center variables? I wouldn't center sex. And certainly if you have like two conditions, you don't want to center condition, right? You want to know what the effect is in that condition. If you center condition, then what do you actually get? You get some weird average effect across conditions, right? Now, your interaction, if you centered condition, it won't change. That interaction effect doesn't change. You'll see that in 2 weeks when we do that homework, that you can center sex and you can form like if you have a regression model where impulsivity and sex are predicting alcohol use, and you center impulsivity and you center sex, and then you multiply them to make an interaction, and then you enter that into the model, the coefficient for that centered interaction will be the exact same if in a different model you didn't center sex and you just multiplied sex times the centered impulsivity. What in that model would change? What have we found changes when we just center?
Your intercept.
The intercept is the only thing that changes, right? There's another important reason that we would center everything except categorical variables, and what is that? Also a test question.
Getting rid of multicollinearity.
Gets rid of multicollinearity, right? Yeah. Do your coefficients change if you center versus don't center? No, they don't, right? Your multicollinearity changes, but your coefficients don't change. And so the same holds true with the categorical groups. If you have two categories and you center it, the coefficients will all stay exactly the same, but your intercept will shift because now the average is the average across groups, right? If they're not centered, then what is the intercept? What does that represent in any regression model?
For your categorical.
Yeah, if you have a categorical variable, a continuous variable, and then an interaction between the two, what does the intercept represent there?
You have two conditions?
Two conditions, yeah.
And the intercept is like the control of default.
Yeah, it's the group that's coded as what? 0, right? The group that's coded as 0. Your intercept is the mean level of the dependent variable in the group that's coded as 0. The interaction, actually, your beta for your x variable, in this case impulsivity, since we're talking about impulsivity and gender, the beta coefficient for impulsivity is then what?
So impulsivity is one of the.
Yeah, if we go back here.
Is that the?
Oops. Okay, so we have this interaction right here, right? And let's say that this is impulsivity. This is, let's just say it's biological sex, coded 0 as 1. And this is 0 and 1. And this is the interaction between the two. Now the intercept is the mean level of y in condition coded 0, right? B of x is what in this model?
The effect of impulsivity.
On? Yeah, it's the correlation between x and y, or the correlation between impulsivity and alcohol use, if that's what we're talking about. In what group?
How many groups do we have?
2 groups, 0 and 1. Men and women. We'll just say men and women. No. It's just the effect, the relationship between x and y in the 0 group, right? Yeah, exactly. So our regression table will give us the average level of y in our 0 group. The main effect of x is the relationship between x and y in the 0 group. And the interaction is what? It's the magnitude of change between x and y when you go to the 1 group. And so if that magnitude of change is statistically significant, then you can conclude that those two slopes differ, right? Does that make sense?
In this example, the 2 groups are 0 and 1.
0 and 1, yes. Does that make sense? I see confused faces. I really want to, what I really want to emphasize is that the intercept is just the difference between the mean of the two groups, right? I mean, technically, or I'm sorry, the intercept is the mean of one group. M is the main effect of that group. That's the difference between groups, right? Does this make sense?
Can you say that last bit again?
So the intercept is the average of group 0, right? M is the difference between group 0 and group 1, the average difference between group 0 and group 1. So if this intercept was 1 and this slope was 2, then we know that the intercept of the 0 group is 1, and the intercept of the 1 group is 3. Perfect. Yep. So these coefficients, this coefficient is just the difference in means between those groups, right? This coefficient is the main effect of x in our 0 group. And this coefficient is the difference in main effects if we went to our 1 group. The point of all of this is to say that you can get everything about 2 groups from a single model. You don't have to reverse code anything, although you can't get a test of statistical significance without reverse coding it. But we'll test this in just a moment so you can have a look at this. I can describe this a little bit better for you. But, all right. We can't use centered variables for our moderator, or for our categorical moderators, right? And that's actually exactly what I just described right there. So if you look here, you can see that I wasted a ton of time, I guess, flipping back and forth. All right, let's talk about what happens when you find a significant moderation effect. So when you do find a significant moderation effect, if your categorical, or if your variables are continuous, right, then we have to do one of 2 different things. What has been recommended by Aiken and West is we pick some point, some meaningful point for our moderator variable, and oftentimes this meaningful point is at plus 1 standard deviation and -1 standard deviation. This is going to get really confusing if it's not already confusing right now. The way that we do this, and we'll work through this in a moment, is we add 1 standard deviation to our moderator variable, or we subtract 1 standard deviation to our moderator variable. Listen closely. If we want to set our model to be at +1 standard deviation on our moderator variable, we subtract 1 standard deviation from our moderator variable. The reason that we subtract 1 in order to get to +1 is that you have a mean, right? And if you subtract 1 standard deviation, let's say your mean is 4, and you subtract 1 standard deviation, it makes your mean now 3, right? Your mean is now 1 standard deviation above, your actual mean is 1 standard deviation above where your new mean is. And so by subtracting, you are setting your actual mean at 1 standard deviation above, right? Similarly, if you want to subtract 1 standard deviation from your variable, you have to add a standard deviation to the mean, right? So if your mean was 4 and you add 1 standard deviation, your new mean becomes 5, right? And that new mean is 1 standard deviation above the old mean, or your old mean is now 1 standard deviation below, right? You can actually test this very easily in the data by just looking at a regression model and saying use only if, right? And then it gives you a quasi-test. It winds up plucking out data. But we'll test that in a moment too. But the thing to keep in mind, and it is always confusing, and I remember when I first learned this that it seemed really confusing, like why, if I want to have it at +1 standard deviation, I should just add 1 standard deviation, but nope, that's not quite how it works. So for categorical variables, similarly, your effects are at 0 and 1. I'm not going to go into that. You don't have to calculate those. And then we have, I'm going to show you this here. So these are two different types of interactions. This is an interaction with a continuous variable from one of my papers and an interaction from with a categorical variable in another paper. And so with the continuous variable, we can see that when we're looking at alcohol pathology, alcohol consumption, there's a strong positive. This is the average, right? This is when everything is centered at 0. We see that when everything is at 0, the relationship between alcohol use and alcohol pathology is this. However, if people have very low protective strategies, that relationship becomes much stronger. And if they have very high protective strategies, then it does what it's supposed to. It protects against the relationship between alcohol and problems. In contrast, this is from a spring break paper where we did an intervention where people got either a positive message or a negative message. And then we looked at the relationship between their norms of how much they think people are using a strategy and how much strategies they actually use. And we find that in one condition, if you think that nobody is using, or you see a relationship where if you receive a negative message, then the relationship between your norms and your use goes up quite a bit. If you receive a positive message, then the relationship between norms and use goes down quite a bit. And this is actually, just not that this matters, but I'll throw it out there. This is actually, the idea behind this is that if somebody thinks that norms are really low, you can give them one message and it will lead to higher PBS use. And if they think norms are really high, you can give them another message and it will lead to high PBS use, right? I mean, just looking at this, it seems like, oh, you should never give anybody a negative message because it just results in lower PBS use across the norm spectrum. But that's because you just have some people who think that nobody does it. Doesn't matter. It's completely unrelated to stats, but I thought I'd throw it out there. We're going to go through and we're going to do this in just a moment. And then this is a kind of basic write-up from that thing. So you guys can read that. I'll leave it up for just a second, and then we will end this and pull up data and start working with data. All right, good enough, right? So, yes, courses, and let's get into this. I'm going to stop this right now.